Choctaw was among the great nations of the Western Hemisphere, with territory covering 23 million acres in what is now Mississippi and portions of Louisiana and Alabama. They were a prosperous people known among the southeastern Native American tribes as agricultural experts. In this episode of Lost Native American Tribes, we'll be examining War Chief Pushmataha of the Choctaw Nation and his diplomatic relations with the Americans. Before the arrival of the European settlers in the 1500s, the Choctaw were known as being a peaceful nation, avoiding military conquest. They had a large population and were secure from attacks by their neighbors. They were so peaceful, in fact, that disputes among tribes in the region were sometimes settled by a game of stickball, very similar to lacrosse. The Mississippi Choctaw, which translates to charming voice, excelled in public speaking and had a strong tradition of doing business. Their oratory skills provided an avenue to advance in Choctaw society through trade relations and to maintain diplomatic peace. By the 1700s, more European settlers arrived, mostly from France, Britain, Scotland, and Ireland. The French established Louisiana in 1700 and maintained an amicable relationship with the Choctaw until 1763, when they lost the French and Indian War. As the European, French, and Spanish expanded their control of land throughout the country in the 1800s, Choctaw boys and men were forced to participate in warfare at an early age, and boys were not considered men until they were part of a war party. Victory in war proved that the Choctaw male had also achieved spiritual protection, which is necessary for military triumph. Americans began increasing in numbers in the Choctaw country and demanding land and treaties so often that it caused great concern for the Choctaws. Many settlers of Mississippi were envious of the Choctaws' well-established homes and farms, often stealing their property and livestock. To keep the peace, one Choctaw warrior who stepped to the forefront was Pushmataha, who was known for his sharp logic and lyrical speaking style. Born in 1764 in Macon, Mississippi, his war exploits became famous throughout the lower Mississippi Valley, where he killed numerous enemies of the Choctaw people, often single-handedly, while escaping injury and capture. Pushmataha's persuasive techniques led to an alliance between the Choctaw and the United States during the War of 1812, when Andrew Jackson appointed him as General of the U.S. Army.
For the Choctaws, involvement in the War of 1812 began in 1811. During that year, a delegate from the Shawnee tribe visited Choctaw country. The Shawnee were a former enemy that had raided Choctaw country years before, but Tecumseh, a well-known Shawnee chief and warrior, wanted to convince the Choctaw to join a Native American confederacy to stop the continued expansion of the United States into tribally held lands. Traveling from settlement to settlement, Tecumseh gave impassioned speeches about Anglo-Americans taking land and marginalizing Native people. He urged Choctaw people not to participate in intertribal wars, but rather to join the Confederacy and fight on the side of Britain in the upcoming war. Pushmataha, the most influential Choctaw chief at the time, traveled to many of these talks. Speaking after Tecumseh, he gave counter-arguments to Tecumseh's proposal. Pushmataha took the position that the United States was an ally of the Choctaw people, and that if the Choctaws attacked American settlements, the Choctaw Nation would be destroyed. At each meeting, the Choctaw people sided with the words of Pushmataha. After speaking at a number of Choctaw villages without success, the Shawnee were eventually ordered by a committee of Choctaw chiefs to leave the Choctaw Nation. In August 1814, Andrew Jackson wrote a letter requesting help from the Choctaw warriors in his upcoming campaign against British forces in the southeast. For Choctaws, this was a difficult request. The tribe had missed out on the fall hunt in the previous year and was running low on food. Accommodating this request would likely mean missing the hunt again. Nonetheless, 795 Choctaws, including Pushmataha, reported to Fort Montgomery and were mustered in as regular troops. In and around Pensacola, they fought in the last skirmishes of the Creek War and would later continue with Jackson to New Orleans to fight with the Americans against the British.
Rather than rewarding the Choctaw for their efforts during the war, the U.S. government imposed the cession of millions of acres of their most valuable property, forcing them to give up the ownership of their native land. In 1820, Pushmataha strongly resisted General Jackson's Treaty of Doak Stand, which called for the removal of the Choctaw from their homeland to relocate to Arkansas, where whites were settled. Pushmataha's protests were futile, and threats from Jackson forced the leaders to sign the treaty. In 1824, Pushmataha and other Choctaw chiefs went to Washington, D.C. for further land negotiations, but it was never settled before Pushmataha became sick and died. He was buried with full military honors in the Congressional Cemetery in Washington, D.C.
Pushmataha died on the 24th of December, 1824, at 60 years of age. He was buried in the National Congressional Cemetery in Arlington, Virginia, with honors. A procession more than a mile long included a train of horses and carriages, cavalry, military, and bands of music that followed his remains along Pennsylvania Avenue. Thousands lined the streets and filled the doors and windows along the route of his funeral train. Among those who attended his funeral was Andrew Jackson, who frequently expressed the opinion that Pushmataha was the greatest and bravest Indian he ever knew. Jackson and General Lafayette stood by with uncovered heads when his body was lowered into the grave.
By 1830, the Choctaw ceded more than 23 million acres to the United States. When Andrew Jackson became president, the Choctaws were forced to cede the remaining land east of the Mississippi River in a treaty with the United States. In 1831, the newly created Bureau of Indian Affairs conducted the first removal of the Choctaws to new land in the West with 3 successive brutal winter migrations. Thousands of Choctaws died, many from exposure and starvation.
After the Choctaw land was ceded, Andrew Jackson, who had called on and received Choctaw aid when he needed it most, signed the Indian Removal Act also in 1830. The same year, he sent government agents into Choctaw country who threatened the Choctaw people with unprovoked military action if they did not agree to relinquish their ancient homeland. Later, the government decided that the removal was too costly, so the U.S. Army was placed in charge of the 1832 and 1833 removals and cut costs by severely reducing both rations and blankets. By 1834, 11,500 Choctaws had been removed to the west. About 6,000 Choctaws remained in Mississippi. By the terms of removal treaty, they were to be allowed to choose individual land holdings of up to 640 acres for each head of household. However, only 69 Choctaw heads of household were allowed to register for land in Mississippi. Finding themselves dispossessed of everything they owned, they became squatters in their former land. Many took to the swamps where they lived as refugees until they were finally provided with a small reservation near Philadelphia, Mississippi in the early 20th century.